Okay. I have to remember to stand fairly central, so I'm in this little circle I've got going on. So, hello everyone, and welcome back to week 2 of Preprints. Next week will be the final week in level 1, and you won't be hearing me from that week. It'll be Claire next week. As last time, if you have any questions, feel free to email me or shout at me on social media. Both work. Email is slightly easier. So today we are on session 2, which is the history and current landscape of preprints. So I'm going to start with the history, then we're going to do a little bit about the current landscape, and we're also going to cover a little bit of the history of peer review, very briefly. And then, as I said, next week, Claire will be bringing you the benefits and concerns around the use of preprints.
Sorry, Johnny, to interrupt, but we have in the chat someone asking if you could raise your voice a bit.
I can talk louder, yes.
Oh, okay, thank you.
So I've already said this slide, so I can skip this one. Okay, so a little bit of a history of preprinting and scientific publishing. Back in like the 15th century, I think one of the biggest early inventions was the printing press. This allowed a much better form of scientific communication because before this, scientists would have to handwrite letters, and it's a very convoluted process to actually spread science out more broadly that way. With the printing press, now you're able to share things much more widely. And then around the 17th century, we found that there were some new sort of developments within scientific publishing. And this is where we've got, I term this historical peer review, but it's also where we started to see the first printed journals really appearing. And then there's a big gap until we hit sort of the 1950s, which is where we have like the current business model. That's where that comes from. We also start to see the beginning of a massive expansion in terms of journals. And this really took off, I would say, more towards the 60s, 70s, and then once the internet came about. In the 1960s, we had these information exchange groups, these IEGs. I'm going to come back to those and talk a little bit about what those are. In the 1970s, we had another new development, which was the peer review in the form you would recognize it today. And then in the 1990s, we had the internet, and archive was created, SSRN was created. And then there's a little bit of a gap until we hit 2013 when we had bioRxiv. There's some developments happened since then, and there's a lot in that middle of all this that I've missed out. But this is a rough timeline that we're kind of going to talk through a little bit. So just to remind you what life was like before preprints, you would submit your manuscript to a journal. It may or may not go out for peer review. You'd repeat this multiple times until everybody in the system was happy. And then your paper would appear to the public. This would take months, if not years. And there's a lot of costs associated with this. So before preprints, as we talked about last time, there were costs associated with accessing work. With the rise of open access, the costs have now kind of shifted towards researchers, and so we pay article processing charges, but the costs are all actually still there within the system. After preprint, of course, you can skip this step and go straight into sharing your work publicly. So I said I would come back to these information exchange groups, and these are really, really interesting because everyone, when they think of preprints and the history of preprints, they all refer back to archive and physics. And we often say physics got there first and they were the first field to really embrace preprints. But that's actually not true. So back in the 1960s, we had these things called information exchange groups. And these were set up in 1961 and they ran until about 1967. During that period, there were over 2,500 memos, which were the preprints produced, and there were over 3,500 participants across 46 countries. So this was not a small thing, it was quite a big activity at the time. And these were set up by this guy called Eric Albritton, and he was part of the NIH at the time, which is the National Institute for Health in the US. And all the costs associated with doing this activity was actually covered by the NIH at the time. The way this worked is very similar to how preprints work now. So you would have your manuscript, your memo, your preprint, whatever you want to call it. You would send that to the NIH, and then they would make multiple copies, and they would literally mail in the post those copies out to participants within those groups. There were a number of different information exchange groups. Each were based on a different topic. So we had, unsurprisingly given the time, quite a few were based around sort of genomics and DNA structure and things like that. However, as you can see, they didn't even quite last 10 years. The reason the information exchange groups ended is largely down to the activity of certain publishers and societies. So there was an article released in Nature towards the end of this period, in which it stated that journal publishers would not accept a manuscript that had previously been released as an IEG memo or a preprint, and that these could not be cited in published papers, which you'll see is very familiar from some of the concerns people have around preprints at the moment. This did effectively end this process. This is also quite similar to the Inglefinger rule, which you may have heard of, which is actually from an editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, and that was in 1969. They came out and effectively said the same thing, which is that if you've posted a preprint prior to their journal, they won't accept it. And that lasted for a long time. The thing was, though, that these were actually very, very successful. So a survey of the members, there was over 94% said that reading a memo had positively influenced their research decisions and directions. And 68% considered that these memos had saved them time and money. And again, these are very similar to the kind of things we hear back about preprints now. But unfortunately, like I said, certain journals, societies kind of put an end to this. And they had three reasons for doing it, one of which was a concern around duplication in the literature. They were worried, as people talk about now, that a presence of a preprint and a published version would cause confusion. They were worried about copyright infringement, and I'm not sure how familiar you all are with things around copyright, but quite often when you publish your paper in a journal, you also sign your copyright over to that journal. So I think this is quite a cheeky thing for them to be worried about, given that they're effectively taking your copyright. And there was also a worry that there would be misunderstandings from the lack of peer review. And again, these three big concerns are things that we see so much still now with preprints, particularly that duplication and lack of peer review aspects. Now, we talked a bit about duplication last time, I think, unless that was in the fellows meeting. I'm getting confused with all the meetings I have. And how this really is, it's not really a big issue. In fact, if anything, it's a benefit because now if you can't access the final published version, you can access the preprint version. And as long as you cite the right thing, it doesn't matter. We also had a discussion about peer review last time, and this is an ongoing thing. We're currently writing some pieces around peer review, so hopefully we'll do a little bit more on that. But this to me highlights why preprints in the life sciences took so long to actually become established. And often the gut reaction would be to say that this is all because of big names like Nature and the big publishers were the problem. Actually, in the terms of preprints, it's often the societies who are problematic. So you can see you've got the American Association of Immunologists here. I think they were the first actually here to state that they weren't happy with the IEGs. And then Science is a really good example because certainly if you're on Twitter, you'll see the editor in Science quite often putting things out to say how great science is and how they're not for profit, so they're on the good side. And this is a good example where your values as an organization really matter. Science might be non-profit, but they're very, very profit driven. They're very driven by making money through Science as their magazine, um, and have been a huge barrier towards preprints throughout the preprint history. However, in 1991, well, in 1990, the physics community jumped on the preprint train. And this really originated because at the time, if anybody remembers, email had a limitation in terms of it was quite a small number of emails you could actually hold, especially if they had things like attachments. Um, Everything back then was very small in size. And this guy called Paul Ginsburg created this central repository in 1991 in response to this email limitation. And that's what eventually became Archive. It wasn't called Archive to begin with. It also was not actually online to begin with. So this repository did not become internet-based fully until 1993. Told you it wasn't called Archive at the beginning. It actually took 10 years from the creation to the name change to Archive, which happened in 2001. And now there are over 2.5 million preprints held on Archive. And just before I move on from Archive, Archive really it's primarily known for physics and mathematic based research, but there are also biology preprints on there, mostly sort of bioinformatics type things. But it really was quite broad in its original aims. And this really forms the basis for a lot of the preprint servers we see in the life sciences. Now, before we get to 2013, in 1999, Harold Varmus, who at the time was the head of the NIH, during the last few months of his tenure there, he became very interested in this idea of preprints and sharing work prior to peer review. And at the time, he proposed the creation of what he called eBiomed. And this was just an electronic repository very much modeled on Archive. However, the New England Journal of Medicine pops up again. They had a big problem with this. They had two big problems with this. One was that they described this as a threat to the evaluation and orderly dissemination of new clinical studies. And they said that this would probably have disastrous effects on the paid circulation of journals. Now, I think it's very clear what their problem here is, which is their bottom line. They're worried about losing money. And of course, we're seeing this issue of sharing prior to peer review coming up yet again. A lot of the people, so this feedback came back and there was an open consultation before this was created. And during that, a lot of individual scientists were very enthusiastic about the creation of eBiomed and of preprints. But it never really took off, in part because of the New England Journal of Medicine comments, but also because the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology effectively came out and said that they would lobby Congress against this if it went ahead. And that kind of was the final nail to prevent this from actually taking off, which is very sad. So if we just focus on a history of preprints, back in the 1960s, we have these information exchange groups. Archive was launched in 1991, SSRN in 1995. eBiomed failed to launch in 1999. That, I think, would have been a really good first point for life science preprints more broadly. And then largely we skip ahead to 2013, at which point both bioRxiv and PeerJ launch. PeerJ you may have heard of, you may not have heard of, is no longer in the preprint space, it no longer exists. In 2020, COVID-19 happened, as we all know, and that has a huge impact on preprints. And then in 2021, we saw eLife switch their model from being a traditional journal format to effectively a preprint review and curation service. So let's focus on this current landscape now. What you're seeing is the most up-to-date information I have on preprint depositing. This is right until the end of 2023. This is not the start of 2024, just so we have a complete year. What you're seeing is that over the last 5 years, preprint has increased massively, and you can probably very clearly see the impact of the pandemic in here as well. And there are now over, I think it's over 750,000 preprints in the life sciences alone, a couple of million, well, a few million now, across all disciplines. See, even this slide's out of date. So there are over 750,000 now. And this is just a good slide to show you some of the important things that have happened along the path. You can see a lot of them have happened more recently. It did take a little while, a couple of years really, for preprints to properly take off. And I would say in 2016 is when it started to really increase, and then the pandemic had a huge effect in boosting certainly life science preprints. You can see that in 2021, about 10% of the monthly PubMed volume were preprints. I've got the eLife model in here, and what I've not included on here, but is a more recent development, is that we saw the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation release a new update to their policies that they offer their grantees. And so the updates were that they mandate preprints now. So if you're funded by the Gates Foundation, you must post a preprint, and they've stopped providing funding, or they will stop providing funding for article processing charges. So I keep mentioning COVID-19 and why that was important. So in the first 10 months of the pandemic, COVID-19 preprints represent 25% of the entire COVID-19 literature, which is huge for preprints. And actually in the first 4 months, this was more like 40% of the literature. And so this shows you just how rapidly people will skip over to a different way of doing something when it's in the interests of society and science first. We also found that the access to this, so in terms of people downloading the preprints, was huge early on. And even later on, within sort of the 10-month period, it was still considerably higher than non-COVID-19 preprints were accessed. So people were really, really interested in preprints and COVID-19 during the first few months. These preprints also had a huge amount of citations and attention compared to non-COVID preprints. And again, this is just to really reinforce this shift in where we were in the 1960s, where it was only the research community that were interested, and even then, the bigger players within that were not in favor of preprints, versus more recent years where this isn't just scientists accessing preprints, which is what you would expect from the citation numbers, but the number of tweets, the number of news articles, the number of blog posts, all of this tells you that it's also the general public who are very much accessing preprints. And being based in London at the time when we were doing this work, I was still working in the lab and I had to travel in on the tube every day to go to work. And it was really weird hearing people talking about preprints on the tube who were not scientists. And so since COVID, we've really had this cultural shift in the terms of how people are thinking and using about preprints. So in 2022, it was about 10% of the literature were preprinted, which I just want to compare this to 2016 when it was only 0.7% of the literature. This slide is also out of date. If you look for last year, it's now 12% of the literature. So year on year, the percentage of preprints in terms of the total biomedical literature grows. And this is because more and more people are using preprints every year. They are becoming much more normalized. It's important not to forget that this is still a really small number though. And one of the biggest issues I currently have is that I quite often come across people who ask me why I have a job, basically, because everyone they know posts preprints. And so to them, it's just a totally normal, everyday thing now. And we need to remember it's not quite. We also know that there's a huge disparity across both disciplines and countries in terms of preprint use. There's a lot of data not available, of course, but you can see that heavily skewed towards the US, Western Europe, and also now China, although that was largely due to the pandemic. And that in the global south, there's a huge lack of preprint use at the moment. This is looking at preprint posting rather than like reading and other kinds of uses you can use with preprints. And so this is something that we really need to keep in mind, and we need to try and equal out a bit more because it's not right being this unequal. and we lose a lot of the benefits of preprints by it not being a truly global effort. I said last week that preprint servers can have different focuses, and I think it's always interesting to look at how the regional preprint servers are functioning, and by far the most successful is Cielo, which is a Portuguese Spanish language preprint server. They're doing amazingly well. The others here are less successful. Africa Archive, just to give you an example, it might have been 2021, I think, data, but there were about 800 preprints on that server back then. I'm not sure what the number is today. If anyone does know, drop that in the chat. And the regional preprint servers have very unique challenges compared to some of the more general preprint servers. I think I mentioned last time that India Archive is actually no longer functioning, or maybe it is in a weird way. I don't think it is currently anymore. And so when you're choosing your preprint server, when we think about the current landscape, I think I said this last time, it's very much an experiment still. And so we're seeing all these different attempts of what a preprint server should look like, whether we should have lots of different ones or a small number of more central ones. That all still needs to play out to figure out what actually works. But there are over 50 different preprint servers now that have a biomedical focus. You'll see the Lancet are in there. There's a lot of journals very much associated with preprints if the publishers don't already own a preprint server. And I think that really highlights just how important they've become. And then you've also got those very field specific ones, which I'm always a bit unsure how I feel about those. But they, in many ways, actually function a bit more like a journal would, only without the peer review and the cost. And the other thing that's started to happen, certainly more in recent years, is these preprint mandates. I've already mentioned the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation mandate, and that was announced last month. But these other organizations here, so the Michael J. Fox Foundation, Aligning Science Across Parkinson's, and CZI, are some other organizations that also, if they fund you, they require you to post preprints. Other big funders like the Wellcome Trust heavily suggest and promote preprint posting and use, but they don't yet mandate it. I think in the next few years that will change and we'll see preprint mandates becoming much more the norm and much more with the big big funders. I'm not sure how many will go as far as the Gates Foundation have in terms of dropping the article processing charges, although I would like to see that happen more. And I should say we will be hosting the Gates Foundation for a longer chat and Q&A about the changes they've announced at some point soon. But it's very interesting to look at how that's all working in terms of the finances for them. It's actually much cheaper for them to have a preprint server that they're running and not pay the article processing charges. The other thing that's started to happen a lot in recent years is that the feedback ecosystem has really, really grown. So we've got the preprints servers at the bottom of this. So you've got your bioRxiv, medRxiv, you've got Center for Open Science, you've got Research Square, Silo Archive. Like I said, over 50 different preprint servers. A lot of those now directly tie in with these, what we're calling these feedback initiatives. And we've got over 35 different platforms that do some form of preprint peer review. And there's a few that I'm going to highlight here. I'll highlight with my cursor. So some of these initiatives are very much minimalist or free form. And these are things like, yeah, it could be just be a single comment in some cases. And you'll see these on social media, PubPeer maybe. Whereas at the other end of this, they're very much journal-like formal peer review. eLife obviously being at the extreme end of that. But you've also got things like Review Commons, the Peer Community In initiatives, Science Collab, Rapid Reviews, Pre-Review. And then you've also got these things which are, they're not really preprint review services. It's more highlighting services, which are things like Prelights. And if you're not, or if you're looking to get into preprints, Prelights is a really good initial step in because you sign up for Prelights and what you do there is effectively you're writing news and views style articles on a chosen preprint. And this is a really good example of a more curation type effort rather than review effort. And you get some really good feedback from the authors when you do this. So I always recommend people get involved with pre-lights. The other thing that's built on top of this is this linking and discovery ecosystem. Now, there's a lot of background stuff that goes on here, which I'll not talk about. But at the front end of these, which is where, as researchers, we would use, the two big ones at the moment really are Society, which is bringing together all of the preprint peer reviews into one place, and Europe PMC. Europe PMC bring together the preprint and all these feedback initiatives all in one place on their website. They've got a really good preprint section now, and I always recommend people go to check out what it looks like on there because they're doing a pretty good job. They're also going to be expanding that in the next few years, which is really cool to see. So the idea of preprint peer review has really become this new frontier. This is the next area of rapid growth. But I said we'd cover a little bit about the history of peer review before we did this. So very common misconception is that peer review has been around for over 350 years and is some kind of well-established gold standard. That is abjectly false, and anyone who says that doesn't have any idea what they're talking about. A lot of scientists say that, sadly. Now, I call this the prehistory peer review, and this is occurring in about the 5th century BC. And this is, we're talking like sort of the ancient Greeks and ancient Syria are big players in this step. Then we have, as I said at the beginning, what I term historical peer review, and this largely occurred during the 17th century. And this was people like Henry Oldenburg at the Royal Society, journals like the Medical Essays and Observations, and a name people are less familiar with, which is William Whewell. And I like a quote he did because I think this is indicative of the direction that we're now starting to go again, and we're almost coming full circle. So this 17th century idea of peer review was not using external reviewers. There was nothing external about it. It was editors and internal groups basically deciding what they would publish. And the thing that William said here, put in bold, he argued that the peer review reports actually would often be more interesting than the papers themselves and would be a great source of publicity for that science. And this is the shift I think we're very at the beginning of starting to see, which is a much greater focus on peer review as a way of getting to the actual paper and the science. eLife are a great example of this. Because of what eLife do now, they put the peer review at the center and at the start of that discovery process with their, I don't know if you've seen it, but if you go to the eLife website, they have a little blurb, a little box at the top of each article now. And that's uses, it summarizes the peer reviews and the paper, well, the preprint, and it uses standard terminology to give you an idea about how reliable it is, sort of what the peer reviewers thought of it. And that acts as a really good source of publicity for the science, if it's good science. If it's bad science, not so much good publicity. But it's also much more useful for the readers who are not familiar with that field. And I think it really gets back down to this original idea of historical peer review. And then modern peer review, as we use it and we know it today, started in the 1970s. And so you can see it's been around for maybe 50 years, not 350. And it's very much an experiment. You can see it has changed throughout this period. The prehistory period, I didn't really tell you what that was, but that was very different from even this historical internal sort of form of peer review, which again is very different from the current peer review we have, which is very external facing. And so we can change peer review is the main point of this. And then the current experiment we're in is open peer review, transparent peer review, and peer review of preprints, which happened, well, kind of started around 2016, 2017. There's a really good article here if you want to learn more about this. And we did do a session about the history of peer review in more detail, which is on YouTube if you want to go and watch that. Just that link. It's only about half an hour, and I think includes this slide. So peer review activity is still very small. I think it's roughly about 2% of preprints are peer reviewed. So it's very small numbers still, but it is growing at a rapid pace. And this is data from Society, one of those big aggregators of preprint peer reviews. The other thing that's really starting to happen is not just people actually reviewing preprints, but the recognition behind preprint peer review is really starting to come along now. So, as an example, we've got 18 doctoral schools across France that have publicly stated that they will accept peer-reviewed preprints as being the same value as an article published in a journal. We also have things like pre-review who integrate with ORCID to give you an extra layer of recognition for that review activity. I said here at PMC do a really good job of doing all this, and they do an excellent job of highlighting the review activity. This is some reviews I had on one of my articles that were available, and this is how it looks in Europe PMC. And again, it's just about highlighting and recognizing that peer review is a really important activity that should be recognized as real scholarly work. The other thing here is, of course, the bioRxiv toolbar, and that recognizes peer review by having it, again, very much as a focal point at the top of a preprint. And these are recognition forms that, well, certainly these ones, are a recognition that journals just don't offer. I mean, journals will give you some ORCID recognition. Obviously, they're valued in terms of promotion, but for the most part, they don't make peer review public. They don't give you that kind of scholarship credit. They view it in a very different way. And so I think this is really helpful in moving things forward in that direction. The other form of recognition for preprint peer review in particular has been at the policy level. So EMBL, which is a big European organization, they do fellowships every year. And in 2022, they announced a policy change that would allow peer-reviewed preprints to be exactly the same in terms of for their fellowships as a paper would be. So peer-reviewed preprints fulfill the peer-reviewed publication eligibility. Plan S, again in 2022, they came out with a new updated version of what they're doing, and that is that most Coalition S organizations would consider peer-reviewed preprints to be of the equivalent merit and status as a peer-reviewed publication. And I already mentioned that the Gates Foundation this year have announced a new policy which is requiring preprints and very much encouraging preprint peer review, and at the same time as discontinuing publishing fees and article processing charges. So you can see that there is starting to be not just a shift at the individual researcher level, but also at the policy level in terms of recognizing preprints that have been peer reviewed as being exactly the same as an article published in a journal. And this really gets, effectively, it means you can't make the argument against preprints not being peer reviewed anymore. Because now this is kind of forcing people to move away from journals are great because they provide peer review to journals are great because of their brand, which is a lot of nonsense in there that we really can very easily debunk. So how do you get involved with preprint peer review? A little while ago, we came up with this preprint review features framework, and this is sort of how a preprint review platform might work. And the other thing that can help you consider which platform to use in terms of who requests the review, who selects the reviewers, is it public or not? Do you get author responses? Is your identity known? What preprint servers are covered? Is there a decision associated with that? So PCI are a good example where you can actually have your preprint peer-reviewed and then published in the PCI journal. So there's a decision with that. Whereas some review services don't have a decision, they just give you a review. I always think it's better not to have a decision because then it's much more about the science again. There are other things you think about, such as whether your review will get a DOI, can you post anonymously, what the review format is, what the license is, all those kind of things. But again, you can read more about that in this linked article. Oh, I do highlight them. So there's three platforms in particular that we generally like to highlight. If you publish with any of the PLOS journals, Review Commons is absolutely the go-to for that. Otherwise, we always recommend submitting to eLife because they're a really good journal and they're doing this totally new thing that is much more to the benefit of science. If you are just reviewing preprints on your own, we usually recommend either posting a comment on the preprint server itself or uploading your review to pre-review. If you do this, you will get a DOI. Yeah, you get a DOI, and you will also get ORCID recognition. So it's a bit better in terms of recognizing the review activity for you. And as I've already said, if you really want to get involved in this at the very early stages, then Prelight is the easiest way into this because it's not really a review, it's just you're highlighting a bit of really cool work, and it's work you find really cool. And that's a really nice initiative. It's a really good team there. So I would always recommend trying to get involved with Prelights as a first step. We also have principles for providing preprint feedback, and we call these the FAST principles. And these are just about how to actually effectively do a peer review. We also have, it's out of date again, but we do have actual guides now on how to perform preprint peer review. Those are, if you go to our website, you'll be able to find those. So what about the future? And there's a question in the chat that you might stop for first. So there's a question, can we add our preprint articles to our profiles for citation or referencing? I don't know what you mean by profiles, but you can request that your preprint be peer reviewed. So pre-review, actually, again, a good example of this. If you post a preprint, they have a system set up so that if you post it by archive, for example, you can press a little button when you upload your preprint and it'll send a request to the pre-review community that you want your article reviewed. And then somebody there, if they're interested, can decide to review your article. You can also send this to the more formal services, so things like Review Commons, for example. When you upload, again, there's a button and it'll send it to Review Commons for peer review. But generally, I mean, if you talk about web pages, university profiles, those kind of things, yes, you can add preprints to that. There's plenty of examples of people who do that. Google Scholar, annoyingly, is a really good one for looking at how people are using your work and bringing all those citations together. So I think someone mentioned last week the issue of having preprints and peer-reviewed articles out about the same thing. Google Scholar condenses all those into one output, so you can see the citations across all of those in one go. There's also a question about why Gates Foundation plans to discontinue publishing fee. Do all journals which follow preprint review model exempt APC? Yeah, so most journals currently have either article processing charge or subscription fees. They might get around some of these a little bit with what they call transformative agreements and deals with universities, but in my experience, those haven't actually been very reliable in terms of publishing stuff. So, you're right, eLife does require an article processing charge. It's at the lower end. They're very much not trying to make a profit off of that. They're just covering the costs. And the rare case I agree with cost covering is if you're covering your costs and you're not making a profit, or you're at least putting that back into the community. I'm not aware of any journals from the top of my head who don't have APCs or a subscription-based model. And that's because, as I said, there are a lot of fees involved with publishing. There are costs involved. So why do the Gates Foundation plan to discontinue publishing fees? They're doing this because article processing charges are hugely inequitable. I'm based in London. I'm in a very privileged position, and even I struggle to publish work if I have to pay an APC because at the time as a postdoc, I don't have funding available for that. A lot of article processing charges are more than the yearly salary of researchers in the global south, so that they're not even slightly acceptable in my opinion. I think ethically they're way out of line. And the Gates Foundation are changing this because they feel that if you're going to mandate preprints, you really need to stop that other side of it as well, which is those article processing charges. You can't just say post a preprint and then we'll also cover those charges. I suspect their thinking has also been influenced by a lot of that work that shows preprints don't change that much when they're published. So there's much less reason to really focus on publishing, and instead what the Gates Foundation look like they're doing is they're focusing on preprints and reviewing those preprints. What initiatives are there to encourage preprint peer review? So I've mentioned a lot of those in here. You've got the slides in the chat, so you can go back through and look at those. We at ASAPbio also have a few, so you could go to our website to look at those. Are there any initiatives by journals? So the journals tend to tie in with other services. So Review Commons, for example, ties in with PLOS really well. And it does speed up the review process. If you post a preprint, send it to one of these review services and then send it to a journal. But as far as I'm aware, there's not any real initiative by a journal or a publisher to encourage preprint peer review. eLife would kind of be that. Can research include preprints as part of the published work? Yes, a preprint is published. So, future of preprints and publishing. What does the future hold? These are things I think. I might be wrong. So we are going to see a growth of preprints. I'm not wrong on that point. We are seeing a greater recognition of preprints, and we are seeing much more preprint peer review. Those three things I think are just going to keep growing as time goes on. And that really leads you to ask how this all fits in terms of a publishing model. I think what we're going to start to see much more of is this publish, review, curate model, which I can't remember if I have a slide. I do have a slide on that, so we'll come back to that. I also think there's going to be a much greater focus on markers of trust and reliability and transparency. I think eventually we will get to a point where we're not judging where you've published, but we're judging how you've published. So is your data available? Are you transparent? Is it all open and accessible? And how are people using your work? And there's some really good AI tools actually that look at that at the moment. And I think that's where a direction we're taking. There are going to be a lot more government mandates and pressure that is top down to change things, and that have already seen some of that. And this is, I don't know how publishers are going to adapt to that, but the pressure is very much on publishers here. We're going to see a much greater global uptake. This is starting to happen, but there's so much more we can do here. We will see more community-owned infrastructure. However, the problem with this is that the big publishers come along and buy it up, and I'm not sure if we're yet in a position where we're really capable of fighting against that and having prolonged community-owned infrastructure. That's a question that still needs to be seen. And also, people on this call, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, you are part of the future in bringing about this change. In fact, you're the most important part of that. So the publish, review, curate model. I said I'd come back to it. The current model is that you publish, well, sorry, it's that you review and then you publish. So you send your manuscript to a journal, they do peer review, all behind closed doors mostly, and then your article is published. The preprint system is publish review, so it flips that around. So now you send your work to a preprint server, it's out in the public, and then it undergoes peer review. At the moment, that is still sometimes opaque peer review, sometimes it's transparent. Depends on whether it's gone to a journal or not for that service. And the publish, review, curate model, which is where I think we will start to move towards, it's very much an expansion of these two, I think. So you still publish with using preprints. So you submit your work to a preprint server. That then undergoes preprint peer review, and this is done transparently. And then there's a curation step, and this is where journals or societies could really come in and actually have a big role. And that's where you bring together the preprint and the preprint peer review into one place, and you say these articles are really good because. I kind of envisage potential situation where literature reviews often might actually fill a lot of this kind of role, and so it's about bringing together the literature and how it interacts with each other and what it all means. There's obviously still going to be a lot of prestige probably tied to the curate step, so I think we need to be very careful to try and avoid that as much as we can. But by having this model, it really highlights openness, transparency at the sharing stage, and also sharing when the researcher thinks their work is ready, not being under pressure by journals who want us to publish as much as possible because that generates profit. It's about sharing work when you're ready, and then having that work very openly reviewed, which means peer review is at the front and center of what we're doing here. and it really highlights the importance of this as a scholarship activity. And then we curate afterwards. And the creation really, you kind of need time to create work because it's almost impossible to look at a manuscript now and say how impactful it's going to be. You just don't know for the overwhelming majority of cases. And what we really need to think about is community ownership and this idea of not for profit. This fits really well into the PRC model. So you have community-owned preprint servers. You can have community-owned preprint review platforms. These could be crowd-based. You can have community-run lists and curation efforts, which Society is an example where you can already do that. Or you could have community-owned overlay journals, and there's a couple of examples of those out there. And ultimately, it's all about shifting that balance away from profit-driven to science and society-driven. And I said we're already starting to see some top-down mandates. So these are two things that were released pretty close together, one from the White House and one from the European Council. And effectively, these both say the same thing. And I've highlighted this, the important bit in bold. But they're both saying that work should be freely available and publicly accessible by default without any embargo or delays. The European Council go a little bit further and say that they want a publishing model that is not for profit, is open access, multi-format, and importantly, there are no costs for the authors or readers. The difference here is that the White House memo is more enforceable than the European Council is. The European Council, this is a suggestion more than anything at this stage. This is really important though, because traditional publishers will fight this heavily, and I'm not sure how they would adapt to this kind of situation. But what this does both together, this says that a publish review create system that is directly supported by institutions and funders. So we're not saying the money needs to disappear. We just need to say instead of paying a for-profit publisher to make billions in profit, put that money into the systems directly instead. So directly fund bioRxiv, for example, or the preprint review services. And people are starting to do that as well. I don't know if it's public yet, so I'll not say any more. But this system, with preprint at the very core of it, can achieve what these two organizations have effectively asked for. And I think that's where the future really is lying. So at the end, and just two more reflective questions, as we did last week. There's a Google form here for those two questions, and if you haven't done the session questions for last week, the Google form is also linked on this slide for that. We've had 11 responses so far to last week's session. These are really just about helping inform me a little bit about what you think and what you've kind of taken away from these sessions, but also trying to get you to think about the kind of things we're talking about. And as usual, thank you to the ASAPbio board, staff, and our funders. And as I've said a few times now, next week you will have Claire, who's going to talk about the benefits and concerns of preprints. Oh, and we have some other interesting things that might be useful. I said we had a history of peer review session, there's a link there. We've also covered a bit of the history of scientific publishing, and then we've got a history of preprints coming up, which might be interesting. And I think that's my last slide. It is, it's my last slide. We've got time for questions, if anyone has any questions.
I think I have a small comment, just answering to one of the questions that was asked about eLife and the fact that they're still asking for article processing charges. But I would like to say that, as Jonny said, this is at the end of the line. It's if you want to sort of really publish your article in eLife as a journal, then they would ask you to pay an article processing fees. And they also have a policy where you just tell them if you can't pay it, you just tell them that I can't pay it, and they will automatically just like waiver the fees. They don't ask you like for a proof or anything. You just say that I cannot pay it because, for example, I come from a developing countries, and they waiver it. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, eLife are really good at that as well. A lot of places,
Yeah,
as you said, a lot of places do request proof of that, which I think is wrong.
yeah. So I think, yeah, the floor is open for questions or maybe comments. Oh, okay, Paul. Yeah, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much for this enlightenment. I just want to ask that this preprint, we know that the whole focus now is going on preprints. Then I want to ask that in the nearest future, don't we think that instead of publishing articles directly as it used to be, that the whole thing will be shifted towards preprints? That's the first question. And the second question is this, that for reviewing, don't you think that the reviewing processes now will be somehow as really editing or reviewing the authenticity of research articles by the publishers? Those are my two questions. Thank you very much.
So I would hope the system moves towards preprints very much being the center of it all. Um, it is moving that way, but it is moving that way slowly. Um, but it is happening. So I think that we will see that in the next, certainly in the next 10 years. The question about review and authenticity. So it's really interesting to think about what this means for not only peer review, but journals more generally. And my I'm quite against peer review generally because all the evidence tells you it doesn't work in its current form, it's not fit for purpose, and things don't generally change between the preprint and the peer-reviewed version. But I am very much in support of having a much more rigorous, in-depth peer review for articles that need it. So these might be things that are directly relevant to public health. These might be things that are potentially dangerous or particularly controversial in some way. I think if we had a system that really evaluated those things properly, so this is looking to make sure that data is actually not fabricated, which peer review does not do at the moment. It's, as you said, authenticity is a really good word. It's making sure that the work is as reliable and as truthful as it can be, in addition to all the things peer review currently does. And so I would like to see that kind of a system develop. The other thing with peer review is that I think we're going to start shifting more towards early career researchers doing that. We've already started to see a bit of a shift anyway because a lot of people are now refusing to do peer review. So peer review it is changing, but I'm not yet sure how it's changing.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Any other questions?
Yeah, and also I would also like to add something, Johnny, is that again, I think we have the power to do all of this. As you said, the future has us in it. So I think we should not be wait, and this is the whole idea of targeting those at the grassroots, is that we are the ones who are doing the science. So we should be the ones who basically say how it should be disseminated. So I think yeah, we should think about us having the power and not waiting like for someone to do things. Yeah.
And that highlights the thing I think is the biggest benefit of preprints is that they allow us to change the system,
Yeah.
and it gives us the power back. The other thing on that is a lot of the things I've presented today and last week are very global north focused, and some like things like the initiatives I spoke about today, that they are very much global north. It didn't start like that. It started as a grassroots effort. ASAPbio has been around for since 2016 now, and we have primarily been a grassroots organization, and it's through those grassroots efforts and it's through individual researchers changing how they do things and coming together that's led to these bigger changes. and it's really starting now to accelerate in terms of the pace of change, and things are moving a lot quicker. We're getting these top-down approaches, but that all starts with grassroots efforts.
Exactly.
There's also a question in the chat about any plans for an institution in Africa about preprints. I don't know the answer to that. We at ASAPbio, our next round of funding, we submit the grant ideas this year, and as part of that, we do want to have a staff member who will be, I don't know if it'll be a permanent staff member or if it'll be contractually based, but either they will be based in Africa or India. We haven't quite decided yet. And that would be to really focus in on one of those two regions to direct our efforts there. But I don't know if there's any plans to form a bigger sort of institution or organization, particularly in Africa. I mean, I guess the reproducibility network is
Yeah.
but like
Yeah.
bigger scale.
Yeah, this is what I was hoping to say is this is part of our effort, is that we equipped you with the information, and then you could sort of go and propagate this information into your community. And then, of course, we're hoping, and this would take time, that your institutions would be sort of more open to the idea. So Musa, that would be on us actually, especially for now in Africa. Oh,
Yeah,
hello.
thank you very much, Lemis. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, because in Africa, especially in Ethiopia, we don't have much awareness about preprint.
Yeah.
And usually we use published article for promotion and for internal grant application and also for other purposes. If universities and research institutions, you don't have an idea about preprint, I think that will be a problem. So I think we are also part of it to propagate this information. Thank you very much for your response.
Yeah, exactly, Musa. I think it's the issue with most of African institutions. It's not just in Ethiopia. So we're all in this together. Okay. Is there any more question, comment? Okay, so I think we really finished on time this time, so this is good, given with all the questions that were asked. So I think if no one else has a question or a comment, we could conclude this session. And again, thank you, Jonny, very much for these wonderful 2 sessions. And we're really looking forward to seeing you in level 2. Yeah, and thank you all for joining.
Yeah, Ramesh, to add
Yeah.
to what you just said, I think Johnny stated that he had just 11 responses for the reflective questions for the previous session. We want to reiterate that the review questions or the evaluations are part of the whole evaluation that we are going to use for the training program and assess whether you can kind of move on to that next level. So we want to encourage everyone to use the links that have been shared and then put in your submissions for the reflective questions. They are quite important for us in terms of reviewing everything that has been going on so far. So we encourage you to do that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Emmanuel. Yeah. Okay. So, good. I think Jonny has posted the link again to the chat. So please, everyone, this is very important for you to fill out. And yeah, thank you. Thank you, guys. See you on the next session.